Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Folklore Podcast. I'm Mark Norman, folklore researcher and author. We've covered vampires on the podcast a couple of times in the past. Way back in season 2, I examined the subject from a general folklore perspective, looking at beliefs in various cultures around the world and comparing those against each other. If you haven't listened, then you can go back and check out those episodes on your favourite podcast app or on the Folklore Podcast website. That was a 2-part episode. Today, we focus on Eastern European beliefs specifically as we home in on the image of the Slavic vampire. Guiding us on this journey is my guest today, Sam Grant. Sam is the author of an as yet unpublished novel based in this area, Bunika. And as we'll hear in this interview, Sam's story is a mix of actual Slavic lore and some of his own invention, but that is based on other cultural beliefs. As part of this process, Sam spent some time in the Slavic region looking at the folklore and the beliefs firsthand, and he'll be discussing this in a moment. But before he does, here is an extract of Bunika to whet your appetite and to paint a picture of the subject, read by Sam himself.
Severine was deluged with a rush of emotions. This was the moment the sect had been waiting for. There was no doubt that this woman before him was the vampiress Bunika, but he had not expected her to look anything like this. As a child, he had scared himself by reading folklore tales. The Neohotni had been rumoured to be tall, stick-thin creatures with slitted eyes and a round mouth filled with triangular sharp teeth. In some accounts, they had been said to have long tongues, the length of a man's arm, which shot out of their mouths and could pull prey towards them. They had paste-grey, sallow skin, and talons for hands and feet, claws which curled over and ended in dagger-sharp points. And they could move fast, so fast that one could hardly see them. At night they became alive, awakened by the platinum glow of the moon, and would move with the quickness of a galloping steed towards their prey. If you saw one, it was too late, since in the next second they would be on you. Severine had always been on the lookout for them when travelling alone, or walking through the streets of Bangskarsti at night. Even now, as an adult, he cared to admit this to nobody. He had been scared, no, terrified, when he was told that Bunika would be making her way over to the cathedral. He had kept this to himself, dreading every watch, and always taking with him a bell to sound the moment he would come into visual contact. This would serve the purposes of alerting the rest of the sect, as well as startling the creature for a short while and buying them all valuable time. But here was the most sensuous and alluring woman he had ever seen, more than he could have even fantasized. She had high cheekbones and brows, quite full crimson lips and beautiful pale clear skin, which reflected the light like a looking-glass. Her eyes were a most piercing azure shade, hypnotizing in their depth and perfection. No, not at all like the vampires he had heard of as a child, and those which sometimes scared him awake on occasional nights as an adult. The vampiress's eyes moved down his body, caressing his neck, shoulders and chest before noticing the sounder in his right hand. Severine was frozen, unable to say a word or shout for help and assistance. He attempted a cry, but his vocal cords, diaphragm and tongue seemed to have seized up. She fixed her sight on the bell. Her eyes widened. Severine attempted to move his right arm up, even slightly to ring it. As the muscles in his arm began to flex, she pounced. Pushing her right leg firmly onto the stony ground in a single movement, wolf-like, she jumped on top of him, with her right hand clinging to his chest, the left clamped fast over the bell to silence it. He fell backwards several feet as the creature raised her right hand over his mouth to muffle any noise as he hit the floor. He cried out as he slumped, exhaling through his mouth and nose, his eyes closing in pain and shock. The creature was straddling him, holding the bell in her left hand. With her right she pulled the clapper out with a single movement and threw it behind her down the passageway. The rest of the instrument she let fall to the floor as she stared Severine squarely in the eyes. Slowly, arching her back, the blue gown falling slightly away from her chest as she did so, she brought her mouth close to Severine's and put one finger over her lips. "Shh," was the only sound she made. Severine's eyes were watering, wide open. Staring upwards, all he could see in the light of the passage was the creature's countenance inches from his own as her red hair fell around his face, stroking his cheeks and neck. It felt soft, brush-like, and smelled of almond and honey. If this truly was a vampire, he began to think the books, particularly the religious ones, had painted a damning picture of them to keep devout men away from such searing temptation. The Neohotny put her elbows on either side of his head, framing his view perfectly, restricting his vision, so that all he could see was her eyes, and the glint of the candles behind him on her lips and teeth. He was completely at her mercy, his heart beating like a war drum with such ferocity that he swore he could almost hear it. She brought her mouth barely an inch from his, and as she spoke, he could feel her breath on his face, her lips missing his only by a hair's width as she talked. "You know me, do you not?" she said faintly. The words came curling out of her mouth as soft as silk, washing over him like a sweet zephyr. Severine was still completely unable to talk, and managed a shaken nod. As he did so, he could see the girl smile, exposing 2 straight rows of perfect white teeth, with short, sharp canines on the far sides. She spoke 3 syllables, gently and slowly to him. "Ma-rik, ah."
So, Sam, welcome to the Folklore Podcast. It is lovely to have you here.
It's very, very lovely to be here, and thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. So before we launch into the world of vampires that we are going to explore in just a moment, let's just explore the world of yourself first for the benefit of our listeners. Tell everybody a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and what led you to be looking at the Kingdom of Hungary in the 1700s.
Okay, so this is not my first foray into writing, but it's my first foray into writing fiction. And I started off by writing reviews and doing interviews for a gothic metal website called Sonic Cathedral back in 2003. So the gothic interest has been there for a very long time, probably even a bit before 2003. So I did that for about 8 years, something like that. And then I co-ran a web scene called Heathen Harvest. And Heathen Harvest was a magazine that dealt with post-industrial music. So I did a lot of work for gothic metal music. And then after that, I wanted something even darker. So I wanted to get into post-industrial music reviewing. And we talked to a lot of black metal artists, death metal artists, power noise, stuff like that. And after that, I started getting interested in academia, and I did a music degree, master's degree. I'm currently doing a PhD in music as well, to do with metal music and identity. So the dark aspect has always been in there. It's always been part of something which I've been fascinated with. It's more a kind of like calling / raison d'etre, I think. And with regards to getting into writing this book, the time, well, it's actually interesting because for a long time, I wanted to write a vampire fiction book. And I wanted to do that from about 2003. But the time was right now because, for me anyway, even though I was confident with academic writing and reviewing music, confidence in fiction writing was something that I didn't have. And that came about because I was a Skyrim obsessive and streaming a lot of Skyrim. And I started to write lore for it, which got included in mods. And the modders really liked what I did. So I thought, well, maybe I could make this actually work. Maybe that'll give me the confidence. And so that's why I started round about now doing that. It just felt like the right time.
So there's a couple of interesting points there. You talk about the Gothic scene and the metal music that you were exploring and reviewing and writing about, and your PhD in terms of that being a sense of identity. And of course, identity is a very big part of anybody's belief system, anybody's folklore, if you like. You know, it kind of tells us who we are in the world. That's the one thing that we can say about folklore. So do you think that that kind of approach to music that you were looking at kind of also nudged you towards the kind of folklore scene as well, if you like?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, identity has always been a big part of the Gothic subculture, and how we define who we are, who we define as, and what sources we draw from for that. And there are multifarious ways you can do that within the Gothic scene, because there are different types of Goths. And so you can have people who are traditional Goths, you can have people who are cyber Goths, you can have industrial, all kinds, and they all form parts of our identity. And each, I suppose, each element of the Gothic scene has its own kind of like mini lore behind it, in a sense. And so there's a sort of logical follow on, I think, from that to doing something like a work of Gothic fiction, um, which, and this one in particular is, I wouldn't say it was heavily folklore based, but folklore is an important aspect of it.
Okay, so
Um,
let's
yeah.
let's look at that a little bit then in that case. So start off with a kind of a spoiler-free summary, as much as you can, of the concept of this particular story. So this is a vampire story. It's set, as I say, in Hungary in the 1700s, and you describe it as being a blend of horror and classical Gothic fiction with LGBT themes as well. So there's a mix of approaches here. So tell us a little bit about the story, about the development of the characters in that, and how those themes fit into that, if you would.
Okay, so it is called Bunika, though some people may pronounce it Bunica, and it's set in 18th century Slovakia, specifically in the year 1712. And it follows the story of a war widow called Marika, who is murdered during a witchcraft trial and intentionally transformed into a unique type of vampire called Neohotny, which in Slovak means the unwilling. And that is a particular type of vampire which I created for this book, but it is a blend of different types of Slavic folkloric vampires. Um, and so there's shall I say a little bit more about what happens without any
Yeah,
spoilers?
yeah, go for it.
Okay, so at the beginning of the book, Marika is abducted from her home in Bratislava, which back then was called Prešbrok. And she is murdered at this witchcraft trial, and she awakens as a Neohotny vampire, which is a half human, half vampire hybrid, different to the Dampier that you see in Albania, but we can get onto that. And for the first third of the book, she doesn't realize that she is a vampire. She thinks that she's survived the witchcraft trial. But we, as readers, drip fed lots of pretty heavy clues that she hasn't survived it, and this is what's happened. She ends up fleeing to Modra Castle, which is somewhere which was invented for the book, and she falls in love with its owner, a girl called Regina, and the two begin a relationship, pretty fiery one. And Marika ends up finding out that the witchcraft trial was no mere trial. Yes, she was murdered. Yes, it was all intentional. And yes, she was intentionally turned to this particular type of vampire or vampiress, I suppose, in her case. And from then on, it's all about why. Why did this happen to her? And she finds out that this Bunika is the lead of a sect who has ordered her turning. And so it's really about that. And from then on, it's about her self-acceptance of this vampire type when she finds out that's what she is, and how those two conflicting halves, one human, one vampire, eventually how she plays it so that they can work together. But there's a lot of psychological conflict, and a lot of self-acceptance that she has to go through to better the situation she's in.
So why Slovakia as a I mean obviously the Eastern European traditions within vampire lore are very strong. We all know that. But why did you choose to go for Slovakia as a place to set this story?
Um, a lot of what I do with regards to artistic creativity is done on gut feeling. And this was not necessarily done because there was particular folklore in that region that I wanted to draw from, which I think is there's a lot of flexibility in the folklore types around that region anyway. Um, and it was because I just felt that Slovakia was the right place to do it, and particular basing it in this town called Modra, which is in Western Slovakia, would be a great place to center half the story. The second half of the story takes place in Central Slovakia, but a lot of what I do goes on gut feeling that it just is the right thing to do, and yeah, that just worked very well for me. And when I went there in person to do field work, then it was kind of verified that it was the right place to go to do it. So a lot of it was done on instinct.
So tell us a little bit about that field work then, because you're talking here about a well-established set of beliefs in a way. Slovakian, Eastern European vampirism is a very strong subject in its own, but you're blending that with your own invention, your own creation, and basing some of that on existing law, like you mentioned the Dampier, for example. What did that kind of research process look like, and what led you to kind of cherry pick the folklore that already exists and then blend your own into it?
Um, okay, so the book is very much a combination of two things. And that's a theme in the book as well. There's a lot of things about duality, and that permeates the substrate of the entire thing in lots of different ways. But the ethos behind it was a blending in itself of classical influences and modern influences. Um, and a lot of the influences are not necessarily literal, but cinematic. Um, so there were like four vampire slash spirit types that make up what Neohotny is. And I wanted something which was very deeply rooted in folklore. I wanted something which was very gritty and something which just felt very fresh at the same time and spoke to me with regards to the exact kind of person that Marika was and the kind of trials, if you pardon the pun, that she had to go through. So it's the Neohotny vampire, which is like I say, it's half human, half vampire, is different to the Dampier in as much as it's constantly at odds with itself. There's always that psychological conflict. A Dampier is often seen as a kind of hero or heroine in a sense. If you think of the computer game character Blood Rain, she's a Dampier. Whereas Neohotny, they just tread their own path. They're way more independent than the kind of vampire type that they are. But like I say, they're always at odds with themselves. There's always this psychological tussling with their situation, and feeding is something which they do not want to do. It's a kind of hateful exercise. And a lot of the time when Marika feeds, which you don't see very often in the book, it is a pretty feral act. And in some cases, it's something that she's almost disgusted with herself at, that she has to do. But so as we go on, there's this very strong focus on how she has to just kind of get used to this, that this is what she is now, and how she's going to carry on living her existence. So I don't know if I've answered your question fully, and I haven't really drawn from all the vampire types that sort of blended together to make up a Neohotny, but I hope that helps in some sense.
Yes, absolutely. So you went to the area. You went to the area to do work. Was that purely to get a sense of the look, the feel of the place? Did you focus on doing research as well into the lore of the area when you were there?
Yeah, it was both of those things. So it was about doing a kind of environmental fieldwork type, and at the same time looking at the lore as well, and looking at the locations as well that I wanted to base the thing in. I mean, funnily enough, a lot of the fieldwork was done after the second and third draft had been read. And what happened was that I went to the locations that the thing was based in. And then I ended up dropping in extra details that were relevant or things which had to be corrected. And and that I think that worked very well as a process because it just refined and smoothed things over quite beautifully. Again, it's the whole sort of instinct thing about the best way that things can work. So there's the environmental side of getting a feel for the place, putting myself physically there, meeting people, being in the soundscapes of the place, how that would have affected the people that were living there, seeing the things, the landscapes that they would have seen, feeling that they would have seen, because those landscapes haven't really changed too much. I'm talking about the Lesser Carpathians, where Modra is. And then there's the social element, meeting people there, speaking to people. I have a good friend now, a chap called Marek, who lives in Bratislava, who very kindly showed me some of the law books on the castles there as well, which is very useful. So it was dual elements there, environmental and social.
We have this very stereotypical view, I think, of vampires and vampirism in that particular area of the world, the Carpathians and around that area, which of course is fueled by Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, apart from anything else, although some other writing as well, perhaps. How much do you think, having worked in the area over there yourself, how much do you think this stereotypical view that we have is actually remotely anything like the way that this law, this tradition is viewed by the people who actually live in the area?
I mean, that's a very big and a very interesting question. Um, and I I think that it's not very similar at all. The the vampire types, the Upir, for instance, which is like the stock stereotyping typical Slavic vampire-like creature, which predates Stoker's work and a lot of the romanticized literature was the Upir was like a savage, feral, uncompromising, reanimated corpse. I mean, it wasn't like anything like you would necessarily see in some of the later works. And it would rise from the grave and prey on the living, and it could shape shift and feed off blood and life energy and all this kind of stuff. And later on, we see this, you know, romantic, sensual, and sexualized vampire type, which gained traction through the work of Polidori and the novel Carmilla later on. But it's very, very different. And part of my intention was to return to a pre-romanticized type of folklore. It wasn't to be anything that was overtly romantic, though there is romance in it, but that's because that's Marika's human side that's experiencing that and falling in love. It's not her feral side. Her vampiric side is bestial, it's animalistic. And so there's this, she exists in this sort of liminal state, whereas she's constantly in this sort of tussle between one side of herself and the other. So this very kind of drastically vicious vampiric side of her calls back to the pre-Stokerish, pre-Carmilla type of vampire into something which the people in the area were terribly fearful of. I'm sure many a sleepless night of locals back in the 17th and 18th century, thinking about these kinds of creatures because they were nasty things. So quite different to what we think of as a vampire now. Definitely different to the sort of Twilight sort of vampire.
Most vampires are different to the Twilight sort of vampire, let's be honest.
Yeah.
Of course, where you have one up on Stoker is that you actually went there. Whereas Stoker only used travelogues and the British Museum and the writings of one or two other people for his background on the area, but you at least went to the country.
Yeah, and I think the same thing was true of Lefano as well. I think when Carmilla was being written, I don't think that he visited Austria. I don't think he did. But this was kind of a trend among writers and artists of the period and before that. It's almost like the Orientalist artists of the 17th and 18th century who would paint these wonderfully lascivious paintings of, harem girls and people in Topkapı Palace in Istanbul or Constantinople. Well, previous to that, Constantinople. And a lot of these painters, like Jean-Jean Lerome or Bridgman, I don't think Bridgman anyway, they never visited the area. So they end up kind of otherizing and orientalizing and reinterpreting things in the context of what they perceived it to be or how they desired it to be. And I think that's what Stoker did as well. And that's what happened with Carmilla too. Even though Carmilla, to be honest, even though extremely different to, the kind of savage vampires we're talking about in Hungarian/Slovakian folklore, very different. I think that Carmilla was a groundbreaking visionary work for what it was, though it probably annoyed a few people. I think Dracula, the book, annoyed a few people because people saw it as being unrepresentative of the folklore and the communities which it drew from. Yeah.
And of course, it's interesting that those views or those paintings, both physical and metaphorical, I suppose, that writers and artists are producing then in that way, they carry forward and they shape a lot of the lore and a lot of the beliefs that we have now about what was actually happening in the area. And I think we find a similar thing in terms of folklore when we look at the ways that folklore was collected in the 19th century and how the views of the upper middle class white male folklore collectors who are sometimes not even collecting in their own country are then thinking about sort of the borders of England and Wales as a prime example where English folklore collectors will go into Wales and collect stories and collect folklore and then come back to England and paint it with their own particular picture and not what was actually happening. And I think probably the same thing happened through those means, through writing, through the work of artists and so on. It kind of clouds what we now know, doesn't it?
Yeah, it clouds things, it refashions things, it reinterprets things. Um, it's a kind of feedback loop in a sense, because what ends up happening is you get people who reinterpret the folklore in the context of what they see it to be or how they want it to be. And that ends up influencing future works. And then the future works become, the rule rather than the exception. And this is not something which has just been localized to, vampire lore, because I think most people don't these days think of vampires as being, animalistic feral creatures. They think of them as being, sexual or sensual types, which is fine, I suppose, because that's how things have developed. But it's nothing like it originally was. But then again, the question of authenticity and originality comes to the fore about, how far back does one want to draw the line? I think the only, time when that's problematic is when we sort of forget where we came from or we forget how things used to be. And I'm all for creative and artistic expression. Like I said, I think Carl Miller is a wonderful work. But I think it's important not to lose sight of what took us to where we are today, and that's why I think it's good to return to this sort of pre-romanticized folklore in the book.
Yes, because of course the visual arts and visual media have a lot to do with this as well, don't they? And the portrayal of the vampire in cinematic terms paints that kind of sexualized, romanticized, sort of evening dress wearing vampire that isn't really a part of that lore at all.
Yes, exactly. And it was probably Lefanu again who started that whole thing off, as far as I'm aware, in 1872, I think it was. I mean, it could have been a little bit before that. Um, but yeah, so that's how we think of things now. But ironically, it was a cinematic work steeped in that kind of atmosphere and visuals that made me want to write a vampire book in the first place. Because in the 2000s, I saw a film by a Belgian director called Jean Rollin. And Jean Rollin used to make a lot of erotic vampire films. And I mean, they weren't like heavily sexual or anything, but they were definitely eroticized. And I always thought about Roland's work that he was excellent with his visuals and his atmosphere. Um, and there are other parts which I thought could be improvable. So it led me down this path of thinking that the vampire genre in its entirety has so much potential and so much going for it that I wanted to write something which was really very classical, but at the same time had modern relevance as well and could be appreciated. There you go. We're back to that whole duality thing. Um, how both of those things work together. So it was that very kind of beautiful, feminized depiction of the female vampire in Roland's films that made me want to write a work that A included that and B called back to a time before that was the case. So again, it's a sort of classical modern blend.
Now, not only vampirism features in this novel, of course, witchcraft does as well, and you have that whole concept of the witchcraft trial or the witchcraft execution, however you want to view it, as part of Marika's story. What did witchcraft lore, witch belief look like in that part of the world at the time that you were writing?
Okay, so at the beginning of the 18th century, witchcraft was, and witchcraft trials and paranoia with regard to the existence of witches was still rife. It was sort of starting to die out in Western Europe, but Upper Hungary, which is what Slovakia was called, Horné of Horsko, was at that point in time witchcraft, the belief in witchcraft and practice of witchcraft trials was still something that was going on quite a lot. And I mean, you're probably aware, Mark, that a lot of the time witchcraft trials were not mere witchcraft trials. They were just an exercise in hysteria. And once the justiciars, quote unquote, had decided that you were guilty, then there wasn't really very much that you could do about it. You couldn't disprove yourself. And this is exactly what Marika finds at the beginning of the book. She protests her innocence, multiple times, but it really makes no difference at all. I mean, that they've decided what they're going to do, and it definitely doesn't end well for her at all. So her experience is very much a reflection of what somebody would have experienced at the hands of witchfinders at the beginning of that period. And yeah, it's a very tragic story. But the same fate befell so many women. It was absolutely awful what happened to them. And yeah, her story is unfortunately just one of many. But it does end up getting a little bit better for her as time goes on.
So the sense of othering is very very prominent in terms of witchcraft accusations at that time. And in Marika's case, we probably have that in a number of different ways, I suppose, as well, because you have this uh, LGBT theme running through it as well. You've kind of got layers of othering there, I guess, as well. And does that kind of feed into the narrative as well?
Yes, yeah, it does. I mean, LGBT relationships in that period obviously were very hush hush.
Hmm.
And it's not like they weren't going on. I mean, they were going on,
Of course.
but people had to be, a lot quieter about it generally. And in the case of Marika and Ruzhena, um, I mean, it's a fortunate position for Marika because Regina lives in this residence called Modransky Hrad, which is Modra Castle. And, if she looks after this castle pretty much on her own, then, they've got a really good place away from the prying eyes of the public where they can just, enjoy themselves. But that definitely wasn't the case for many people. It wasn't the case for the commoner. If you had lots of money and Regena's family are quite wealthy, then it's probably easier to do that. But yeah, it is a heavy theme in the book, and it's really about the intensity of their relationship and how they work together and how this is part of Marika's self-discovery. Because a lot of this is about self-discovery and self-acceptance. I mean, Marika starts off, well, she was married, but we don't see her husband. She's a war widow. He was unfortunately killed in the War of Independence that finished in 1711, just before the book takes place. And there's this part very early in the book when Rosena says to her, do you miss your ex-husband? And she's like, yeah, I do. I mean, we had a really good relationship, but it never felt completely right to me, and I never understood what that was about. And, how many other people find themselves in that situation when they're in a relationship and they're trying to accept what their sexuality is. And through her relationship with Regine and Regine's encouragement, she ends up exploring that. So yeah, it's a very heavy theme which is linked to self-acceptance, again linked to accepting oneself as a half human, half vampire.
And this is a book, isn't it, that really has a number of themes running through it. It has that horror element, it has the gothic element, it has the vampirism to it, but then it has these human stories as well. I mean, you describe it yourself, I think, as kind of love and self-discovery and empowerment as themes of the story as well. So it's not a classical, traditional kind of this is a book about vampirism and horror, is it? There's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, and the funny thing about that was that that wasn't really intentional. Like when the whole thing started off, um, it's not like I necessarily thought, not that this is what's being said, but I'm just speaking to myself in as much as when it started off, I didn't think, right, I'm going to put theme XYZ in. These things developed very naturally and organically because I think they came from something subconscious and internal within me. And the, scenes and environments which I've been exposed to over time, that they just came out very naturally in the writing. So it wasn't like I was thinking necessarily I had to include lots of things. It was an organic, very, very natural process. Um, I'm all for series or literature, which is just, basic, let's do our vampire fiction and have fun. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Vampire Diaries. I think that's a lot of fun. But I much prefer things which have these different substrates or stratigraphy. And there are various themes such as duality, deception, death, rebirth, even the importance of color within the book links to certain events and different psychological states But yeah, this was a very. It may sound overcomplicated and enmeshed, but a lot of those themes are obvious and some are not obvious at all. And the extent to which people may observe them or not is just down to how people read it, literally and metaphorically.
One thing that I think it's worthwhile addressing probably is the kind of look and feel of this story. It's very easy in terms of cinematic vampires to get a sense of that kind of look and feel of the place. You think about some of the classic vampire films, it represents that very well. When we're dealing with these themes in folklore, of course, we're talking about the representation of things through a symbolic language. Folklore is very much about symbolism. It's very much about the interpretation of things in that way. And I guess when we look at this kind of area, that's also true in terms of writing about it from a fictional perspective as well. So how do you represent that? You kind of, themes, symbolism of the lore that we're talking about here in terms of the novel.
Um, so one of the major themes in it is something which draws from lore, which is, well, globally prevalent, but it's not actually based in the region, which is the cycle of death and rebirth, the great cycle of nature. Now, this is more of a Hindu influence that I'm drawing from here, because I was raised as a Hindu and I learnt Sanskrit. And so this idea of the Kali Yuga, the great cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, is something which is very important to this novel. Now, Marika ends up being murdered and she is reborn as a vampire, but that is just one part of the cycle, and throughout it, we see a lot of references to death, rebirth, the cyclical nature of things, about the Ouroboros. And that's dropped in with references to serpents, which we see in odd, unexpected places. So it's actually coming from that side of things, for me anyway. Um, and one other related theme is that of color, and color plays, it's quite subtle, it plays an important signifier. In Hinduism, the color blue represents truth, and in the context of the book, the truth is the truth of oneself, of one's true nature. And like in Hinduism, you'll see the goddess Vishnu is always blue to represent the truth of oneself. And at the beginning of the book, Marika is shown to be wearing a blue sheer gown, a light blue sheer gown. And that transparency represents fragility. But she's still got that ability to know herself well, that potential, but she's quite naive. As things go on, and as she accepts her new self as a Neo-Hotny vampire, then her sartorial fare begins to change. It becomes darker blue. It stops being translucent and it starts becoming opaque. And this symbolizes her strength and her hardness and how she's accepting herself more and more. And that's just one of the ways that color is represented throughout the castle. Throughout the book, because in the castle, in Modra Castle, parts of the castle end up taking on her personality as well. And blue is represented in the castle as a safe zone because it's about herself and her being. So yeah, that's one of the ways in which things are represented, but that's a kind of sort of more of a Hindu thing rather than a local thing.
One final question before we wrap up that's just come to mind, and it wasn't something that I was thinking in advance I would ask, but based on what we know about you and what you've spoken about, I think it might be quite fun to explore this. If this story was being filmed for a cinematic version, based on what you study, how would you score the music for it?
That's a lovely question. I think that it would probably be a mixture of things. I think I would go with a combination of traditional Slovak music and something from the modern side, probably in the dark ambient genre. Um, Keeping things, you know, very intense, but not necessarily rhythmic. I mean, later on in the book, we see the utilization of a instrument called the konkovca, which is a type of shepherd's flute, and it's it's an overtone flute, and so you have two notes which are played simultaneously. It's quite ritualistic or shamanic, if I can use that word. So I would probably utilize that, and as well as that, yes, some dark ambient as well, probably cinematic dark ambient, um, to make things, yes, particularly intense and in a sort of unrhythmic emotional way. There's kind of undercurrent of unease, but beautiful at the same time, which is the essence of Gothic, I think.
Excellent. It's a good answer. Thank you. Okay, so finally then, if we've been through all this and this has whetted people's appetite and they would really like to read this, they can't at the moment because this is an unpublished book, right? So this book is in submission for publication at the moment. So I want to open up this last little bit to you to provide your elevator pitch for anybody who might be listening to this who has an influence in the publishing industry or who works for a publisher or who thinks that this is a book that should be read. How do you pitch this as being a book that should be out there?
This is a fresher take on the vampire genre. It can be read on multiple levels, something vibrant, something energetic, something gritty, which is the modern side, but it also has a classical, very deeper side to it as well. And so, therefore, if people are into things like Nosferatu, which is going to be released in 2 or 3 weeks' time, and they want something classical, extremely dark, thought-provoking, and emotional, and they want to read something which is literally historical but also has modern relevance to it as well, then I think they would definitely enjoy reading this, especially if you're a fan of books like Dowry of Blood or The Historian, that more kind of literal intellectual kind of vampire novel. I think you would definitely enjoy this.
It's a good summary. There's a lot to this book. From the point of view of people listening to this podcast, certainly there is the whole historical background of the traditional vampire lore and witchcraft of the Eastern European area, and the research that's obviously gone into that, alongside a very strong storyline and clear messages that go with it too. So I wish you the greatest of success with it. I will certainly be pushing hard to do what I can to get this out there because I think it deserves to be read. Thank you very much. If people would like to find out more in the meantime, you have a presence or presences online that they could check out for the novel and for yourself. Where would you like to direct people?
The website is bunikanovel.com, and that's the main thing that tells you all the information about where it is, what's going on, the main concepts, the characters. There's a development blog there as well, which I don't tend to, update every week or two, so I don't clog people's inboxes. Every couple of months I will do. I'm also pretty active on Blue Sky, and there is a link down the footer on the website about how to get there as well. And I'm very reachable through Blue Sky mainly.
Perfect. I will put links on the Folklore Podcast website on the episode page for this episode to all of those places so that you can go and seek out more about the novel. I would certainly recommend the website. There are all sorts of things on there, the kind of the development blog, as you say, and the roadmap and some concept art that will give you an idea of what some of these characters might look like, as well as some narrated excerpts from the novel as well that people can check out too. So, Sam, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and talk to us. I wish you all the success with this novel, and I shall look forward to telling people more about it. I am fortunate enough to have a copy of the manuscript, so we will ensure that we can get a kind of pre-publication review feature of sorts onto the website alongside this interview as well, and then we can give a full review when the book is actually available for people to read. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm extremely thankful for the opportunity. And yeah, let's catch up again soon. Thank you very much indeed, Mark.
It is my pleasure. Thank you. If you want to learn more about Bunika the novel, or about Sam or his research into this area, then head over to his website at bunikanovel.com, where you'll find everything you need. There's a link in the show notes for this episode and on the Folklore Podcast website. A big welcome to those of you that have joined our Patreon recently, both as free members or on a paid tier. You are all very welcome there. I'm about to start releasing a new round of exclusive content to all of our members over on Patreon, so if you haven't joined yet, then now is a great time. Free members get access to our storytelling episodes, Stories from the Hearth, and there are some brand new ones coming up this month. And if you upgrade to just £1 a month, a tiny amount in the grand scheme of things, but meaningful to the podcast if you're all doing it, then you'll get access to chapters of our folklore audiobook partworks. Above that, then you can join the Patreon Discord server, and there'll be access to some field recordings coming up there soon too. The address you need for all of this, patreon.com/thefolklorepodcast. Please support the show in any way that you can, be it financially or by sharing the show around to anybody that you know. Thank you. In next weekend's release, we'll be learning about a new folklore-themed audio drama which retells the story of the Lambton Worm from the perspective of a female protagonist. And there'll be a chance to win some exclusive merch. So join me then, because who doesn't like a hoodie? Thanks for listening. See you next time.